Good morning, everyone. My name is Elena Simone Tyler. I serve as Associate Pastor for Justice and Mission here at Westminster. And in this capacity, I'm really fortunate that I get to work really closely with the Social Justice Ministry team. The Social Justice Ministry team builds the forums around a common theme every year. And the theme this year is diving deeper together so all will flourish. This theme builds on our heightened awareness of the systemic and critical issues affecting our community, brought to greater attention in recent years, most especially in response to the murder of George Floyd. Through the forums, we will learn about long-standing needs and become more prepared to support the flourishing of all members of our community. Today, we welcome two friends from the Advocates for Human Rights. We welcome Michelle McKenzie, who serves as Deputy Director, and Amy Lange, who serves as Court Observation Project Coordinator. The Presbyterian Church has an entity known as the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance group, and they produced Locked in a Box to help Westminster and other congregations learn about our siblings who are caught up in the immigration detention system here in the United States. After we watch the short documentary, Michelle and Amy will offer insights and they'll respond to questions. We'll also learn more about the Immigration Court Observers Program through Advocates for Human Rights in conjunction with the University of Minnesota. For those who are attending in person, you can raise your hands when we get to that portion of the morning, and we'll be happy to take your question or comments. And if you're joining us online, please feel free to use the live stream. Joe Beld, one of our elders and chair of the Faith in Action Council, is monitoring the live stream for those questions. So thank you, Michelle and Amy, for being here, and thank you all for coming to learn about this important topic.
The individual I visited today, he's an older gentleman. He has 2 boys, 2 daughters. He has 3 grandchildren. Graduated high school in this country. College graduate, works hard, owns a house. His wife's a teacher. She's a U.S. citizen. He has lived basically his whole life here. And is now going to be deported.
It's a different perspective to experience going into the waiting room, to hear it going into the visitation room and seeing fathers and mothers and children.
Estar ahí es como estar en un ataúd de cemento, pues. Está muerto en vida uno ahí.
We began hearing these varieties of stories. We began to experience and to feel and to understand more deeply the inhumanity of all of this in terms of how the system operates.
In the 20-plus years I've been working with refugees and asylum seekers, I've seen a massive expansion of the use of detention. From about 6,000 people in detention in the 1994-95 period, now detaining up to 500,000 people in a year. More and more prisons have been converted to immigration detention centers. It's become big business.
I feel that we live in a country that values families. We have a system that tears families apart.
So we're seeing sometimes 3 generations as well as an extended family suffering because of the removal of one individual. Often that individual is the breadwinner. They usually take the dad.
He should be enjoying his grandchildren playing on his living room floor. He should be enjoying his meals with his family. He didn't get to enjoy any of that.
To what extent has our reliance on detention become more about the business of detention than about the individuals?
It's now become institutionalized to the point where there seems to be a lot of people whose interest it is just to let it continue.
So many people think of immigration as being a border issue, but when we talk about detention, there are over 200 detention centers around the country, so it's in almost every state.
What's meant the most for me is having it personalized through conversations with detainees.
It's an opportunity to expand your sense of community. And you can't do that by reading about it or by hearing about it, but really by being part of that space.
Immigration has become more than a Washington issue or a political issue. Immigration has become a very human issue because you see the face of immigration.
شمكة تطوير لوطق هلا سمعك سمعت ምናልባት ኣብቲ ቤት ማእሰርቲ ስለዚኣትኹም ኣይርዳእኩም ንኾኑ 4 ዓመት የጸኒሐ ምክንያት ማእሰሪያ ግን ናይ ሃይማኖት ምክንያቱ ኣብ ሃገርና ከም ዝበልኩኹም ሃይማኖት መሰል ናጽነት ሃይማኖት ስለዘየለ ተሓቢና ኣብ ንጽልየሉ ዝነበርና ክፍለ ግዜ ኣብ መንግስቲ ምስ ረኸበና ናብ ቤት ማእሰርቲ ኣቲና ቤት ማእሰርቲ ዛራ ይበሃል ናይ ማዕድን ወርቂ ዘለዎ ዝርከበሉ ኮይኑ ናይ መንግስቲ ቦታ ትሰርሓሉ እዩ ስለዚህ ዛራን ኣብኡ ነገልግል ነርና ንሰርሕ ነርና ማእሰርቲ ኣይኮነን ኣብ ጎልጎ ትሰርሕ ኣብ ጎልጎ ኢኻ ትድቅስ ተኸቢብካ ኢኻ ትሓድር ካብዚ ድማኒ ዕድል ስለ ዝረኸብኩ እቲ ዝሕልወና ዝነበረ ምስ ደቀሱ 4 ሰባት ክንሃድም ክኢልና ኣጋጣሚ ኮይኑ እዚ ዕድል ስለ ዝረኸብና ግን ካብ ሃገረይ ክወፅእ ኢለ እውን ሓሲበ ስለዚ ይፈልጥ ግን በዚ ኣጋጣሚ ነዚ ዕድል ምጥቃም 4 ሰባት ተማኺርና እውን ኣይኮንናን ወፂና ብዕድል ኢና ወፂና
Yo era director de un medio de comunicación. Me comenzaron a extorsionar y entonces cuando ya no pude pagar las extorsiones, mataron a mi hijo. Las autoridades no hicieron nada. Entonces cuando no respondieron a mi demanda, empecé a demandar, a denunciar por las redes sociales, por todos los medios que pude tener a mi disposición. Y eso no le gustó a muchos, sobre todo al jefe de la policía de mi pueblo. Quisieron que al final yo tomara la decisión. Estoy huyendo de los delincuentes, pero también estoy huyendo de la policía. Y yo no quería arriesgar mi vida, pero no tenía opción.
I've talked to thousands of people in detention, and every one of them, there are pieces of those stories that stay with me. When you see what it means to have lived through war, what it means to have lived through seeing family members killed in front of you, having been in jail where people were actively torturing you.
Almost everybody, I think it's not an overgeneralization, almost everybody who comes seeking asylum is in some level of post-traumatic stress. They've suffered violence, they've witnessed violence, they've been threatened, plus all of the stress of the voyage that they've taken. And then they're locked up for months on end.
They come here for protection. They come here because they think of America as the land of freedom, and then find themselves sitting in a jail cell.
ዝኹሉ ግን እቲ ክረኽቦ ዝደሊ ዝነበረ ሰላም ንምድላይ ስለ ዝነበረ ካብ ኡጋንዳ ብናይ ኣሕዋተይ ሓገዝ ናብ ዝሓሸ ቦታ ንክበፅሕ ናይ ናፅነተይ ንክረክብ ጉዕዘይ ኣበጊሰ ኩሉ ሙሉ ከባቢ 3 ወርሒ ወሲድላይ 8 ሃገራት እዚ ኩሉ ግን ንምርካብ ኣብ ሂወተይ ሰላምን ናፅነትን ጥራይ ነይሩ ምስ ካልእ ነገራት ኣነፃፂረ ከም ቤት ማእሰርቲ
Pasé durante 2 meses, mi travesía duró 2 meses en México, comiendo de lo que hagamos en el camino, frutas que le pedíamos a la gente y así. Trabajamos ahí, con lo que ganamos ahí, abordamos la bestia. Encontró y así pasamos, 6 días en el desierto. y a media hora de llegar a Tucson me detiene la policía. Así es que tuve que estar detenido 447 días. Alguien decía en el centro, esta es una ballena blanca de concreto que nos arranca la vida. A mí me parece que la detención nos roba parte de nosotros. Cada día que pasamos detenidos es como estar muriendo en vida en un centro de detención.
I knew absolutely nothing about immigration detention. And then I made my first visit.
ምክንያቱ ኣብ ኣሜሪካ ወላ ሓደ ቤተሰብ የብለይን እቲኦም ኣሕዋትي ኣለዉ እንጂ መፃኒ ከሎ ሰብ
I thought this is a really important thing for us to be doing.
Llegó a mi vida otra vez el ánimo. Y recibo la primera visita. Yo, durante todo el tiempo que había tenido de estar encerrado, no había recibido visita de nadie.
Most people have no idea that one of the largest immigrant detention facilities is in Georgia.
The Stewart Detention Center was originally built as a medium security prison. Seeing how far away it is from Atlanta, it takes about 12 hours to get down and go back. The detainees don't have access to legal assistance.
I visited a young man, and I was his first visitor in 9 months. And he was pretty hopeless at that point. And I was so struck by the lack of due process. Most immigrants in detention don't have legal representation. I had a range of emotions, compassion for this person, but anger at the system. And that began to fuel this unexpected passion. It was no longer just starting a new volunteer program, but it was really personal for me.
It was so important for me to see him again because it had been 3 months. And during that time, I had Thanksgiving, I had Christmas, I had New Year's, my son's birthday, my birthday.
Every time you arrest one person on a traffic stop or some trivial cause, you're really breaking up several generations, and you're also affecting the well-being of that family, which in turn affects how the children are going to do in school. It affects people in the church who have to support them. It affects the grandparents who have to provide money and clothing and sustenance for children that they never expected to have in their homes. So there are all kinds of effects that may occur.
Every time I enjoyed a good time in my life, I thought about him. And I thought, he's missing out on this with his family.
My parents came to the United States from El Salvador during the Civil War. So I grew up, I'm kind of seeing them go through the immigration process as well. I didn't quite understand the immigration system as a whole, and then I heard about the detention visitation program here and felt compelled to continue visiting. I was the first person that had visited this individual in 6 months, and it just broke my heart. I felt like I compelled to continue.
I guess what surprised me is that I thought I was coming as a volunteer, but I left realizing that, no, this is a friend. We connected very quickly on a human-to-human person, like friend-to-friend. He did lose his case, so I just want to make sure that I see him again, and I don't know what's happening next.
ምክንያቱ ንዓይፍሉ እዩ እንደገና ኣብኡ ነራ እንደገና ንምሳይ ዝነበረ ከይደ ክሪኦ ከለኹ ፍሉ እዩ ክድቲ ዝበለጥ ሓደ ነቲ ኣብ ምሳይ ዝነበረ ክረኽቦ ዝዓበየም ግን ተስፋ ንክህቦ ምክንያቱ ተስፋ እንድሕር ቆሪፅካ እቲ ዝዓበየም ሞት
There's about 250 different facilities across the United States that hold immigration detainees. One thing that surprises a lot of people is that a huge number of those facilities are run by for-profit companies. Private companies that are trying to make money and profit by holding people in detention.
Part of the growth of the U.S. detention system has been driven by the increased use of mandatory detention rules, which strips the individual officer or judge of the ability to make a decision whether or not that person really needs to be detained.
I was surprised to find out that taxpayers had spent $160 per person per day. I remember working with one man who had been in detention for 4 years.
We've created this massive immigration detention system with fixed quotas for how many people should be detained on any given day. And we as taxpayers are paying for that, even when those beds are empty.
The only outcome in 90% or more of the cases was that those would ultimately be deported. But while they were there and for periods of up to 3 or 4 years, they were just inmates. And that sheer warehousing aspect was depressing. I was just struck by how poorly we're addressing as a nation this question of immigration policy in all of its forms.
Immigration detention today is more about public messaging than it is about compliance with our immigration laws. I lock you up so that somebody else will think twice about coming here. It doesn't work.
Before, I thought immigrants needed to be detained because they're not citizens, they're breaking the laws. That's what the belief is. The majority of them are held on civil holds. No criminal act has been committed. Why are they being held as violent offenders? Held in a maximum facility?
The majority of people in detention, they have no criminal background whatsoever. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings out there, thinking that all immigrants who cross into this country without papers are committing crimes, and that's not true. In the immigration detention system, Congress is dictating to Immigration and Customs Enforcement that they have to hold a minimum number of people each day, that number being 34,000. So that's telling a law enforcement agency that they have to fill those beds. They have a huge motivation to keep them held in detention to meet that 34,000 bed quota.
It develops its own self-interest in order to maintain that. People who are investing in it, people who are working in it, and it creates its own power.
Because of that, it does push the average agent to choose probably more on the side of detaining the person rather than releasing, because they know ultimately that those beds have to be filled. The people that are being held inside of them are being treated much the way we treat criminal prisoners. Their freedom of movement is totally restricted. Most of the time, there's no access to go outside or have recreation. They're being monitored at all times, and there's a lot of indignity in that.
So the second time I went, we were talking, and it was cool just catching up with a friend, talking about life, talking about family, everything. And afterwards, I realized this is weird. I, for a second, completely forgot that we were enclosed in a box. And so when I left, and I'm like, this person is in a box, and I'm walking away and seeing the town in which this box was placed,
There's no natural light, there's no sky. You're just locked in a little room, a little box. And you think about the fact that the people you just met with are going through that experience for weeks or months or sometimes years.
Se desespera. La prisión es dura. La libertad es lo más lindo y sagrado que puede tener un ser humano.
I remember one time picking up a client who had been detained for several months, And we were driving away from there, and he looked out the car window and he said, I haven't seen a sunset, haven't seen the night sky for the past 8 months.
Leaving the detention center, it was really hard to even speak about it. Feeling powerless because the issues are so big and so systemic.
It's happening here, happening everywhere. It's not far away from us, even though we try and think about it like that. It's not happening to those people, it's happening to the people in our lives.
It's difficult to see, but it's the reality. How can you see this and not want to respond?
The deep sense of isolation, of aloneness that people feel when they're stuck between those walls. All of that shatters when we start visiting and we are in contact with them.
So that visit breaks down that isolation and dehumanization. It's a moment or a space where you are actually being present to that person and treating them like a human being, perhaps for the first time since they've come to the United States.
And I guess that's one of the purposes of a strong visitation program.
I've just continued to go because, like I said, it's drawn my circles wider, my community is wider, so I'm gonna keep being there. I'll support, my friend in any way possible.
We recognize that it's really important to share the stories. Part of why we do visitation too. We want to share, but we want to share in a way that protects their stories. You can talk to your friends in your community and get the word out about what's happening and the way the situation is.
Visitation is knowledge. You gain compassion. You gain understanding.
Tanto lo que significa para personas como yo, que estamos en detención y que no tenemos a nadie en este país y que lleguen a verla, es como resucitar a alguien que está a punto de morir.
It's about actually being present to another human being. And I think that's partly what makes it so beautiful.
Es un encuentro, visitación es la oportunidad de encontrarse y llevar ese calor humano, esa fuerza de la esperanza, de fe, que muchos allá adentro perdemos. Entonces, visitación para mí es la oportunidad de encontrarnos como hermanos y poder solidarizarnos.
We're called to carry God's love to people, and especially to the strangers and to the wounded and to the sick, to the imprisoned.
ንሰምዕ ራእይ ማለት ህይወት ምቅያር ማለት እዩ ምክንያቱ ካብቲ ሓደ ዝመፃካ ዘሎ ህይወት ምቅያር ማለት እዩ እቲ ኣብቲ ቤት ማእሰርቲ ዘሎ ነቲ ብደገ ዘሎ ነቲ ብደገ ዘሎ ካብ ደገ ዝመፅእ ከዓኒ ነቲ ቤት ማእሰርቲ ዘሎ ተስፋ ዝህብ ስለ ዝኾነ ናይ ተስፋ ምቅያር እዩ እንደገና እቲ ብደገ ዝመፅእ ዘሎ ድማ ካብቲ ቤት ማእሰርቲ እንታይ ዓይነት ትምህርቲ ወሲዱ ይኸይድ ማለት እዩ
Every single day, there are people experiencing this, fleeing something, showing up at an airport somewhere saying, I'd like to be protected in this country. Today, there are new people being brought into detention centers.
There's so much talk on a national scale, a state scale, a local scale about immigration. I think visitation is important because it can take it beyond the course of just talking and debating about ideas into the realm of their people that are impacted.
It's important to visit and see it and put a face to that.
Where we can start, we can come down here and show them support, that there is compassion.
One of my real hopes is that one day there are visitation programs going to all of those 250 facilities where people are being held in detention.
The power of visitation is a rediscovery of our humanity, both for those who are detained as well as the visitors who are visiting them.
What I would like to see happen is that we work on breaking down barriers. The immigrant is part of who we are.
watching so attentively. I was talking with Michelle and Amy just a little before we started, and Michelle commented that we can't watch something like that without and miss the opportunity to process it just a bit. So the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance group prepared a study guide, and these are just a few questions that don't have fixed answers. They're just questions that will prompt us to kind of process what we've seen. And then we'll spend a little time on these questions and then hear from Michelle and Amy about what they've seen and about what's happening, particularly with our siblings who are coming to us from Afghanistan. So I would just invite those of you here in the room and also those who are watching online, what's staying with you from what you just saw, and what are you feeling? What thoughts are uppermost in your minds? Jill, go ahead, and I'm going to grab the mic.
Do we indeed have detention facilities in Minnesota?
We do, and Dwayne can tell us a bit about them. Thanks, Dwayne.
Yes, I'm a retired lawyer. I did pro bono asylum work, and today there are 5 or 6 county jails in the state of Minnesota that have contracts with ICE to serve as detention facilities. And the one of them, this is northwest of here, I can't remember the town, but it's a bigger town in the state that I understand. They earn more on those detentions than they earn from the state of Minnesota for detaining criminal suspects. And the sheriff is using that money to expand the jail, and the last I heard, does not allow any visitation.
Thank you, Dwayne. What else? What other images or words from the film? What's staying with you? George?
Gonna be fast. I never knew anything about this, and I'm disappointed that the government apparently is not trying to find ways to get these people into society or back to their own countries. But I never knew anything about this, ever. Sorry.
Oh, no. One of the images that's staying with me was just seeing those dots that it's happening right here in Minnesota. And a word that just hit me in the gut was the word warehousing. Anyone else want to share?
We have something from the chat that addresses the third question. Marilyn is wondering how she can engage in both visitation and advocacy for systems change. And I'm sure many of us in this room have that same question.
Thank you, Marilyn. We will definitely hear from our advocates for human rights folks. I would also put a plug in for subscribing to Westminster's advocacy alert. We have scripts and phone numbers and ways that you can find out who represents you so that you can make your voice heard about these issues. I'm so grateful that Michelle and Amy are here, so I'm going to turn things over to them.
Thank you. Do you want to take that one, this mic? Okay. Since we have a 2-mic area. I'm Michelle Garnett McKenzie, and
I'm Amy Lange.
And we're the Advocates for Human Rights. Sorry, that was...
We're part of the Advocates.
The Advocates, for those who don't know, we're a downtown partner. If you need to know anything about us, Dwayne has been a volunteer with us since before I joined the staff back in 1999, so he can tell you all about us. But we are a local organization that works with our home community, especially on migration issues, and with partners around the globe. And we're really proud to be able to partner with Westminster this year, so thank you. before we get to the immigration court observers, I would say, and maybe you can talk just briefly about our sister program, sibling program, Conversations with Friends, which does visitation here. Both Amy and I have been involved with Conversations with Friends for as long as it's been around. So.
Yeah, so we'll talk more about court observation. I run a project where we monitor immigration hearings at the Fort Snelling Immigration Court, which is right by the airport or by the tennis bubble at Fort Snelling. And I'm also a volunteer with Conversations with Friends, which is a local organization that does visitation and pairs people as pen pals so that they can write to people in detention. Everything was upended with the pandemic. So visitation is occurring right now with Freeborn County Jail, and that's happening on Zoom. There was visitation with Carver County Jail, but they're not housing ICE detainees right now. And it is true that there are some county jails that have ICE detainees that refuse to participate in the program, including Sherburne County, which is in Elk River, which has the biggest bed capacity. And despite a lot of work, Conversations with Friends has not been able to get in there. But I would just say that everything you heard in the film, we hear expressed, both the power of being a visitor and the absolute coercive, heart-numbing, soul-crushing experience of being in detention. And see that in court too. People who have a viable pathway forward here so hate being detained that they choose deportation and permanently tearing their families apart. And we're all complicit because our tax dollars go to that.
So our court observation project is something that started in early 2017. We have engaged, I think, close to 1,000 individual observers by this point.
Maybe not quite that many, but yeah.
Like we're at about
750, 800, something
right.
like that, yeah.
We're creeping up on that, and we are getting thousands of observations in court. So what we do is try to witness what's happening in the courtroom and how detention is impacting people's access to immigration justice. And the results have been really profound on both our findings and on the observers themselves. We use a court monitoring methodology where we're sitting in and documenting what's happening in order to kind of identify systems problems. And I think the most amazing parts that we get out of that is the transformation for the observers. So, Amy?
Yeah, you can't hear those stories one after another or just witness the despair and not be transformed. So one of the things we gather data and we use that to both inform stakeholders. We've done a report that really addressed the court and that the judges really took to heart when we said, you may not be able to impact the laws because that takes congressional action, but you can treat the people before you with dignity. And it was very impressive because actually the chief immigration judge required all the judges in the Minnesota court to read that. And we have seen some changes, not as much as we want, but just you need to acknowledge the story and the anguish of the person in front of you, despite whatever decision you have to make. And that makes a difference. I mean, we heard all the voices of people, who had somebody visit for the first time and how it gave them hope. To recognize the humanity in another person is transformational, especially if that person is traumatized and isolated and afraid. But what we weren't sure, the purpose of the program wasn't necessarily to transform observers into activists, but that is part of what has happened. And so people have lobbied state legislators and congressional representatives. Observers have written public comments on pending regulations, and these are well-informed comments because they can say, this is what I see over and over in court. And so more and more we try to identify what's the human impact, and where can we influence the court, and what requires system change, and how do we have that happen. But the most important thing is for everybody in this state to know that in the shadow of the airport, every day, there are people being taken into detention, there are people being deported, and there are families being torn apart. It really impacted me under Trump's family separation policy when people flooded the streets all over the country to say, this is appalling. You are ripping the child out of the hands of their parent and separating them. Except we do that every day in immigration court. We're just ripping the dad out of the house and sending them away. And the kid comes home from school and daddy's not there anymore. And that's just as outrageous as ripping their child out of the hands of their parent. And we're all responsible for that happening.
So you notice the film was made in 2015, and there are some details that have changed since then. Obviously, COVID wasn't in place, so they were going to in person to talk to people. But the system has been essentially the same really since the 1980s, and then in 1996, when there were some serious changes to the law that created more mandatory, non-discretionary detention for people. So you saw that timeline where it started at about 6,000 people in detention in the early 90s per day on average across the US, and went up to 500,000 people per year, or 6,000 per year, 500,000 per year. You heard about quotas, a 34,000 bed quota. We blew through that and now are at 50 to 55,000 people capacity on any given day. We saw some decrease during COVID. That's coming back up. And right now in Minnesota, we're seeing people shipped up from the border to make additional bed space for people down at the border. So this week we had a group of 40 people arrive and they're, I think, up at Candy-Ojai County Jail, another one of the counties, where there are people from, I think, 6 or 7 different countries who were brought up, all of whom are seeking protection, seeking something that is a fundamental human right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution, and to be protected from being returned without a hearing, without somebody to say, let's consider whether international human rights law protects you or not. That hearing process is complex, and it's growing increasingly difficult because we've essentially shut down the adjudication side of our immigration system since COVID. And we have systemically underfunded it. So we have just a tiny fraction of people who make decisions about asylum cases compared to the 50,000 or so enforcement agents nationwide. And you just can't shove that many people into a little tiny funnel and hope to get decisions made. Right now we're waiting about 10 years, I think, for asylum decisions because it's taking years to get an interview and years more to get a decision as the system tries to move asylum officers around. And that will only increase with the arrival of this large number of people from Afghanistan who all will need asylum applications filed. But stepping back before even that.
I just want to clarify one thing, which is there's parallel things that happen. So some people are going through deportation proceedings or asylum hearings. I mean, they're all considered deportation hearings. Like, are you going to get to stay or are you going to have to leave? The whole time while being detained, and other people are going through it while living out in the community. That's so right. That huge, long backlog is people who are not detained. When you're detained, it happens so fast that sometimes you're out of here before you've had your first attempt to try to find an attorney, because as it said in the, but was sort of glossed over, we don't provide attorneys. There's no public defender type system because these are civil matters. So you only get a public defender if you can't afford your own lawyer in a criminal system. So most people are navigating this whole thing on their own.
Right.
And most people are not English speakers, and so you're kind of out of luck.
Absolutely. Thank you. It is this dual track system of very quick expulsion and relying on people being isolated so that they give up. One of the most profound findings we're tracking with the court observers is just how many people give up and say, forget it, I can't do this anymore. I'm terrified to return home, but I can't stay in prison any longer because it's taken, weeks or months, or it's going to take months to get their case heard and make a decision, and they just can't do that. So the coercive element of detention.
And often what they're saying is, I have to feed my family. So I won't earn a living if you send me back to whatever country. They might kill me, but I have to try to provide for my family, and I can't keep being detained. So we hear that every week of somebody saying, my family's hungry, I'm the breadwinner. If you're not going to let me out to fight my case on the outside, then send me back so I can try to feed my family, knowing they'll never see their family again.
And we have kind of, as you said, two groups of people in detention. One is people arriving seeking protection, and one is people who have lived long periods of time in the United States, here in Minnesota, in their communities. Our average length of detention is somewhere over 10 years.
You mean average length of time they lived here, yeah.
Residents in the United States is somewhere over 10 years of people in detention.
Right.
So people who've established lives, have jobs, are working with, have their children here, parents, but who are undocumented. And so this is really, I think, a fundamental failing of how our immigration law is set up. I mean, why would it be this way? The way that the immigration law right now is set up is mostly to get people expelled or excluded. It's not really to bring people into the United States. It's been in place, we've had the same structure since 1965, and there are so many ways you can fall out of immigration status, and very few ways to get permanence here. So say you come as a student to the United States and you can't pay your tuition one semester, you're out of status and become undocumented and deportable. And you can't fix that while you're in the US. You have to leave. You come as a visitor and you stay a day later than you're visiting, you're out of status. You can't fix that and become authorized to be here. And there are very few ways in to become integrated and just build your life here. So those things are really pulling at one another and creating so much stress in communities. So that's in our detention system, we see both that arriving asylum seeker and that long-term member of our community, both of whom we're called to welcome, right? So it's really been a tragic endeavor. Where's our time? And do we have questions? Okay. Yeah.
The Haitian migrants?
Yeah. What hasn't happened with the Haitian migrants?
The slave catchers came and whipped them, and
yeah. The juxtaposition between the people seeking asylum from Haiti and those seeking asylum from Afghanistan right now could not be more stark. And this replicates how we've treated arrivals, migrants from Haiti for decades. So some of you may remember in the early 1990s, many Haitians fled by boat to the United States. US Coast Guard policy is to interdict them on the high seas and try to get them back, because if they don't get to the United States, they don't have the right to seek asylum. This meant that we at one point in the 90s were offshoring people at Guantanamo and are looking at doing that again now. The people that we saw most recently, many of those folks came to the Americas for the Rio Olympics build-out. They were brought as migrant workers and have been unable to return to Haiti because of the disruption and political violence and all of the natural disasters that have befallen Haiti through many complex reasons, right? And so there's been this group of people looking for a place to get asylum for several years, and that is a big part of who was at the Del Rio border. People have been expelled. Deportation flights to Haiti have been taking place very rapidly to try to clear out that. We're seeing, as I said, people shipped up from the US border so that they can take more Haitians into custody. And there was just a request for contract proposal to kind of ramp up detention down on Guantanamo for Haitian and Central American detainees. So it's been a confluence of really horrifying events alongside a response to people fleeing Afghanistan, which I think is, certainly the best response we could have made out of the precipitous decisions that were taken along the way as we withdrew from Afghanistan, where what we're doing is paroling people into the United States before they're granted asylum or given refugee status. Right now there are about 60 to 70,000 Afghan arrivals at military bases, and as you know from this congregation, they're starting to cycle off those bases and arrive in communities. We expect to start in Minnesota over the course of the next few weeks, seeing up to 2,000 people from Afghanistan resettled here. And they have temporary 2-year parole status and will be allowed to stay during that time. They are getting their work permits expedited, and so they should be able to get employment. There will be centralized sites, hotel sites, where people will be held and housed, and in a non-detained setting while they process their cases. We'll have legal clinics over on site at those facilities. We're expecting to be up mid-month. They'll be ready for us there. All of those people will have to, unfortunately, file applications for asylum, and those will be on an expedited time frame according to the continuing resolution that just passed last week for the budget negotiations. So that could change, but we are really expecting a very dramatic uptick in asylum, further exacerbating the backlog. And meanwhile, we're doing everything we can to push Haitian asylum seekers out of our sight of our view. And it's who's convenient, who's valued, what are the political ramifications of denying entry to Afghans, denying entry to Haitians. It's that political calculus we've made around immigrants for a very long time. We will be needing volunteer attorneys with, I'm looking at you, to do some, to help us round up enough people to help on site with legal advice clinics. We are gonna need an extremely robust response communally, and we're also going to need to remember that we have over 1,000 open cases right now at our office. Many have been pending for a long time. Many are from Central America. We have 700 unaccompanied children who've come, no, 500 unaccompanied children who've come to Minnesota in the last year, most of whom we haven't been able to find. So the needs will be very deep for legal assistance and for accompaniment work and for monitoring what's going on in our court system as it happens. So I know we've got volunteer opportunities and things that are continually circulated.
To say one thing really quick,
Yep.
because I said kind of cheeky about the slave catchers, but I wanted to say that the racism of our immigration system is, there's just not a word to describe how entrenched that is, both in our laws and in our discretion. And so I mean it, the pictures of the whips and the grabbing and the darker your skin, the more you're dehumanized in our immigration system. And one time in court, that's very obvious, from who gets arrested to how they're treated to who we view as dangerous, and that's on all of us to remedy.
Yeah, we are in our last minute. I know there's a question that maybe we can answer online, and I'll give this to you.
Actually, if you all would just hold, bear with me, we are Absolutely able to take one last question. I just want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you very much, Michelle and Amy, and we know we'll continue to be in conversation. Next week, we will welcome the leaders from the Envision Project. They'll talk to us about intentional community and about the micro homes that they would like our help in getting located. So thank you so much. And then now, Joe, the question, please.
This is actually more of a comment, to bring it home comment. This comes from Reverend Doug Mitchell, who lets us know that this is an issue that has a direct Westminster connection already. Our Westminster member, Matthew Echu Ngang, one of our members from Cameroon, was arrested and held in a county jail north of the Twin Cities for months and has been placed on a plane and sent back to Cameroon, leaving his wife and children here. So this is an issue with direct bearing in our own community. Thank you for the opportunity to share that.
We have a group to co-sponsor refugees, and last week, Wednesday, Council of Churches was notified that an Afghan family was coming here the next day. And so we were called on less than 24 hours notice. And so I went out to the airport to greet them. They were very small greeting. And it was a woman and her 4 teenage sons. It was supposed to include a teenage daughter, but somehow she wasn't in the group, and I don't know yet what happened. So it's very complicated, and that's moving very quickly.